All right. Hello, everybody. It's good to be here. I want to thank the Manitoba Forage and Grasslands Conference for having me, in particular Larry for having faith in me to come up here and speak. This is my first time to Canada, and I'm excited to be here and learn about the different things that y'all have to deal with in agriculture. I've been traveling around the US for a long time, speaking with a lot of livestock producers, and now being here with y'all. I've been pretty amazed at what you have to contend with regard to the cold. I thought that the Texas heat was challenging, but I'm pretty sure y'all have a little bit more to contend with here. So today I want to talk about connecting the dots between soil health and human health, and how understanding these connections can help us turn the tables and grow more nutrient-dense food that can nourish ourselves and heal many of the ailments, many of the preventable ailments that we're suffering with today. So as agricultural producers, we have epic potential, right, to decrease human disease and affect our climate. And it's my goal today to help you become a change maker in your community and to apply soil health and nutritional practices that can not only improve the nutrient density of foods, but will also improve your health and the health of all the people in your community too. So my journey in agriculture began after about 18 years in the holistic health field as an herbalist, nutritionist, and chef. And after living on a ranch in Uvalde, Texas, where we were raising grass-fed beef, I really realized the strong similarities between soil health, human health, and particularly the microbiomes that link us together in the gut and in the soil. So as a nutritionist for 20 years, I was always helping people improve their microbiomes in their gut so that they could digest foods more efficiently. And then when I started looking at agriculture and seeing the soil, I was like, wow, this is exactly the same thing. And nobody's going to get any healthier until we begin to improve the health of the soil. So I went back to school and got my degree in agriculture. And now it's my passion, as Larry said, to help people understand and become aware of human, animal, and land health as one. And so by providing education and outreach is the way I do that. So this quote by Wendell Berry really kind of sums it up. There should be some profound resemblance between the treatment of our bodies and the treatment of the earth. We need to move our focus away from organs to organisms. And so by looking at the big picture, we can really start thinking holistically. And it's that is going to help us improve. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And we can definitely make change through doing this. So we've all heard the quote by Hippocrates, let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food, right? So how many people in this room have been able to heal an illness that they had by changing their food patterns or taking on a diet? All right, a few hands out there, but not very many. So this is truly a statement. I truly believe in this. Nutrition is the foundation of our health. But as time moves on, it becomes really much harder and harder to get the nutrients from the foods that we're eating. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is because they were maybe grown in a way that doesn't allow them to have as many nutrients as they used to have. And two, they could be refined. Or three, it could be that we cannot properly digest those foods because our GI tracts are so degraded that we literally don't have the capacity to pull nutrients out of that food. And a large part of that is because our GI tracts are broken down and the microbiomes in our guts have been degraded by different things from refined foods to glyphosate in our foods and various things like that. So we really need to focus on improving the composition of the human GI tract. So more and more evidence is coming into play, showing that scientific studies are showing that fruits, vegetables, and grains all have less protein, calcium, phosphorus, iron, riboflavin, and vitamin C in them than just a few decades ago. And if we think back to Randy's talk last night, it's not that these nutrients are not in the soil, right? He showed us the total nutrient digestion test, and there was tons and tons of minerals in the soil. It's more the fact that in the soil, the microbiome isn't able to secrete the enzymes that are going to mineralize these nutrients and allow them to be taken up into the plant where they can then turn into biomass that either animals can eat or that we can eat and take on that nutrition. So ultimately, we really need to think about how we can increase soil health to allow that digestion of nutrients to happen. Another really interesting thing is that as CO2 levels rise in the atmosphere, we are not able to, that's going to decrease protein content in grains. And so scientific models are predicting that by the year 2050, potatoes, rice, wheat, barley, and other grains are likely to decrease 6 to 14% in protein. And that is epic proportions of decreases. So as a result, 18 countries, including India, are going to lose another 5% of their already low protein rich diets, right? Which is going to cause major issues in terms of, keeping people healthy and keeping people alive. So these alarming declines also have a ripple effect for meat eaters, because our animals are eating less protein rich foods, less nutrient dense foods. And so the meat that we're eating also has less nutrient density in it. And Fred was talking about that earlier, right, with the phytonutrients. So we've got to be careful here. We've got to pay attention to how we can make a difference here. So let's go ahead and dig in and talk about why nutrition and soil health are more important than ever before. So for one, we've got physical and mental disease running rampant, and many of these things are preventable diseases. And they're also happening in the wealthiest of countries, right? So here in Canada, in the US, we have money galore happening, but we have some of the biggest health issues that are happening amongst everybody in society, whether you're a child or an adolescent or an adult or an elderly person. It's really, really all kinds of disease are becoming apparent that are not benefiting any of us. So ultimately, many of these preventable diseases have to do with the degradation of our GI tracts. And I'm going to talk more about that as I move on. But we need to focus on how we can improve that and utilize our nutrients more efficiently. So the second thing is that our ecosystem processes, such as the energy cycle, water cycle, nutrient cycle, and community dynamics that increase biodiversity are all being degraded as well. And these broken cycles are creating losses of valuable nutrients. And so it's also on a macro level changing our weather patterns and our climate, which therefore, again, are decreasing protein contents in our food. So we also can't forget that these grave threats that we're dealing with from a climate perspective and from a nutrition perspective have major, major influence on our mental health and our mental well-being. And we're seeing massive amounts of mental illness and suicide in society as well. And so that is a very scary thing to think about too. So for a lot of people, and maybe not as many people in this room, but for many, there's a real widespread disconnect between where the foods come from, right? From the food sources. And we've also created a large disconnect from our capacity to heal, right? We really, really have a strong capacity to heal in this body. They're very capable bodies. But overall, we have kind of given up our autonomy and our agency to the allopathic doctrine of medicine. And the allopathic medicine has been helpful in a lot of ways, but in my opinion, it can't be the end all be all, because it completely fails to teach that nutrition can heal ailments. So another show of hands, how many people in this room have had a meaningful conversation with their doctor about how foods could heal them? Very few, right? I see one hand, maybe two hands coming up. And, I'd like to meet those doctors, because more power to those folks. That's good that they're teaching that, but it's very much uncommon. So what we've done is we've made a habit of thinking in a reductionist manner, right? And we've been thinking on a fundamental level instead of thinking about how all the parts of a whole are interconnected and are in interrelation with one another. So we've reduced our agricultural practices and our medicinal practices to treating a symptom, right? Rather than thinking about the bigger picture and looking at, how if we improve soil, we can mineralize nutrients and make them available, or how if we eat better foods, we don't have to take a drug to lower our blood pressure, right? So ultimately, we have to remember that everything is connected to something else and everything has consequences. So there is always going to be a consequence. It's going to be negative or positive, but rarely is it just going to be neutral. And so ultimately, we've got to think about these factors. So the 4 factors that I mentioned a minute ago, which is basically looking at mental and physical illness running rampant, ecosystem processes being degraded, and also giving up our power of autonomy into the allopathic doctrine. Many of these things are very grave, right? But ultimately, we can work in unison to create a better way. And by thinking about human, animal, and land health as one, as an interconnected living system. And so by doing so, we move out of reductionist thinking into holistic thinking, which creates greater resiliency, which is what we're all looking to do in this room, I believe. So this is another quote by Sir Albert Howard from England. When nature farms, she recycles everything. She never wastes, always leaves a reserve, always has a period of fallow, and always includes animals. And if we follow nature's lead, we can regenerate our agricultural systems. So before we move on what we can do to regenerate our ecosystem health and human health, particularly the GI tract, we need to understand how our soils and gastrointestinal tracts got degraded. So from an agricultural perspective, there's two main influences that are degrading our soils. First is, I got a little messed up. First is the loss of organic matter in the soil. And loss of organic matter generally happens through tillage, right? And tillage is going to mix oxygen into the soil, which heats up the soil and is going to burn off the organic matter. And it decreases because it increases organic matter decay when you have that heat there, right? So ultimately, when we remove this organic matter, we remove the food for our soil fauna, and that contributes to, and that soil fauna contributes to soil biodiversity, which acts as a reservoir of nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, many other things as well, trace minerals. So it's the main contributor to soil fertility, right? And I've heard many of you talk about it here, being in this area that was deep, rich soils, grasslands that were made over many millennia are going to be, the topsoil is decreasing, right? So in Iowa, topsoil is decreased from about 35 to 45 centimeters, from 35 to 45 centimeters at the beginning of the 20th century, down to 15 to 20 centimeters by its end. And so overall, through tilling and disruption from vehicles and other things, wind and water have whisked away 57 billion tons of topsoil, which is where all that nutrients is. So one time I was watching, and I wish I had the image here, but I went to a workshop with Alan Williams, and he showed me a picture of the Dust Bowl, right? We all know what that cloud looks like coming through, the big dark cloud that everybody was watching coming, and it was dark black. Well, just this summer, some of the same things happened, right? Some of the same clouds formed because of desertification that's going on from agricultural practices. But those clouds were not dark, they were light. They were just as dense and just as rich, but they didn't have any topsoil in them. So instead of being dark, like what we saw during the Dust Bowl, we see this very light cloud, which, that just goes to show what we're dealing with. We have a total loss of nutrients here. So overall, we have to also remember that on a global scale, the soil has more carbon in it than the atmosphere and all the biomass on the surface of the globe combined. So there is basically twice the amount of carbon held in the atmosphere and 3 times the amount of carbon in the soil than in all the vegetation combined. So we really have a great capacity to bring our soils back into health and sequester some of that carbon from the atmosphere and hold it, well, it's going to cycle, but hold it deeper in the soil as we move forward with better practices. So we need to really hone in on that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the second factor in agriculture that I think is contributing to the assault of our soils. And that is the use of herbicides and fertilizers. So I know that this is a means to an end. And by saying what I'm saying, I don't want to offend anybody in the room. I know that we're in a place where we have to use these things to some degree at different scales of agriculture. But I think it's really important to talk about this. So ultimately, glyphosate, also known as Roundup, is classified as an herbicide, but it is also a strong antibiotic in the soil and in the human gut. So every time we put glyphosate down onto a plant, whether it's in our yard, whether it's in our farm or our garden, we are basically putting an antibiotic into the soil that's killing the microbiome in the soil. And then when we consume those foods, it's killing the microbiome in our GI tract as well. And so since 1974, over 1.6 billion kilograms of glyphosate active ingredient have been applied. That's 19% of estimated global use of glyphosate. Also globally, glyphosate has risen 15-fold since Roundup Ready genetically engineered glyphosate tolerant crops were introduced in 1996. And 2/3 of the total volume of glyphosate have been applied in the US from 1974 to 2014, have been sprayed in just the last 10 years. So use of glyphosate has gone up. And what's really, really interesting is with that use of glyphosate, human illness has developed at much greater rates in terms of autoimmune diseases, food allergies, Alzheimer's disease, all of these different things. So glyphosate is having a major, major impact on our gut microbiome, which is decreasing our health from a major, major standpoint. And I'm going to give you some books to read when we get to the end. So if you want to know more about this and really delve deep into some of this, because these are very complex things to consider. So I'll give some resources for you guys at the end. Another thing that's important to remember is that glyphosate does bind in the soil, but it also has the tendency to leach into groundwater. And so glyphosate was detected in 36% of a total of 154 water samples from Midwestern United States where glyphosate is extensively used on corn. So owing to its extensive usage, this chemical may pose chronic and remote hazards to the ecological environment and human health by way of human ingestion from food and water. So from a human health perspective, we also have some things that are degrading our GI tract. And don't worry, I'm going to get to a point where this gets more positive. Okay. I'm just setting the stage here. There are things we can do, but I think it's really important to look at the depth of what's happening here. So ultimately, lots of antibiotics are being used and other medications. And so this widespread consumption and the widespread consumption of refined foods void of nutrients and laden with chemicals will also be a problem with our GI gut degradation. So one of the books that I want to give y'all as a resource is called Super Gut, and this was written by Dr. William Davis, and he's written a number of different books like Wheat Belly and a couple of other things like that that are very popular books. But ultimately, he talks about how modern life has caused a massive loss of bacterial species in our guts that have important functions in human health, including mental well-being, and he likens the loss of microbes to the equivalent of an inner extinction event, like the dinosaurs. But one that can be reversed through our choices. So unfortunately, antibiotics are like a time bomb set off in the GI tract, and it causes massive microbial devastation. And it takes years to rebuild a microbiome, which often never fully recovers after antibiotic use. And unfortunately, this is something that Fred was also talking about, but the commercialization of motherhood has greatly increased the likelihood that a mother gets antibiotics either right before she gives birth or right after she gives birth, which is basically decreasing her ability to pass on her microbiome to a little baby that she has just had and that she wants to nourish and give support to. But what's also scary is that antibiotics are prescribed to infants and toddlers twice the rate that they're prescribed to adults. That's a very scary thought, because how is any little person ever going to build any type of microbiome, right? So this mass extinction event, it really is unbelievable. And ultimately, when Dr. Davis has had the opportunity to look at a few different societies that have had no exposure to things like antibiotics and herbicides and pesticides, and they're eating a completely natural, almost wild foods diet, they see these really, really beautiful intact microbiomes that have none of the same species that we have in our refined and modern microbiomes. And ultimately, what's interesting is that these microbiomes, whether that tribe is from Africa or whether the tribe is from South America, they have the same different bacteria and fungal species in them. But the microbes in terms of our modern guts are all across the board, depending on where we live. And so ultimately, we really have taken away so many of the different microbes that even have huge influences on our mental well-being as well. So our mental well-being is very much determined by our gut microbiome. And in my opinion, I think a lot of us are really struggling mentally without without and emotionally without having that GI tract intact, the GI microbiome intact as well. So ultimately, we're also not even considering that 70% of all medically important antibiotics in the United States are sold for animal use. And each time we consume the meat from these animals, we're also taking in those antibiotics, and they're also winding up in our water supply as they're defecated from animals and humans. So it's really something to consider there. All right, and the second factor is the degradation of our foods, right? So many of the foods that we eat are refined and heavily sprayed with glyphosate. You know, when we look at this picture here, and we are eating a completely colorless diet, right? Everything's brown, everything's been refined. All the nutrients, all the fatty acids have been taken out of these foods. They may be enriched with a few different nutrients that somebody has deemed to be important, right? They've put those back in, but we're eating foods really, really rich in glyphosate because a lot of these crops have been sprayed with a desiccant of glyphosate to get them to die before they're harvested. And we're also taking in very little nutrition from them because they've been refined. So when we're looking at that type of thing, it becomes very challenging. And ultimately, we have to think about those secondary plant compounds that Fred was talking about. Those secondary plant compounds are everything. And this is a variety of tomato that I saw when I was up in New York. They were growing this particular tomato because it's rich in anthocyanin. And anthocyanin is what's in blueberries and various blue foods in general, and is very, very helpful. It's a phenol, right, in the GI. And I mean, it's a phenol in the body, which has a lot of anti-cancer effects and helps with a number of different heart disease issues and things of that sort. So they're growing these tomatoes, right, so that they could increase those antioxidants in the food. But what's really interesting about this is that these secondary plant compounds basically make up roughly well, there's only about 150 nutritional compounds that we're tracking in human food composition tables, right? But that's only 0.5% of the roughly 26,000 chemicals that are in our food, good, you know, natural chemicals that are in our food. And so 99% of the biochemicals present in food are untracked by nutritional diseases. And so we kind of call this nutritional dark matter, right? These are all the things that we don't know anything about yet. We're learning. The work of Fred and his colleagues are really trying to understand these a little bit more. But we don't just need macronutrients, proteins, fats, and carbs, or micronutrients, you know, our vitamins and minerals. We need all these secondary plant compounds to act as medicine inside our bodies, just as they act as medicine inside of our livestock's guts as well. So ultimately, between the loss of organic matter in the soil, the onslaught of agricultural chemicals and antibiotics and other medications and refined foods, we're really being duped right before our very eyes as the pervasiveness of all of these illnesses that us and our loved ones are struggling with become more and more profound in each generation as we move forward. And so this is something that we can do something about. So before I move on to what we can do about it, I'm going to talk a little bit about the similarities between the GI tract and the soil. And I'm going to quote basically this farmer, Patrick Holden, who wrote a beautiful essay on how he has seen the soil as digestion, how the soil digests just like the human gut. So soils and GI tracts are like parallel digestive systems, and understanding the intimate biological symbiotic processes involved in digestion sheds light on equivalent processes taking place in the soil near the rhizosphere surrounding a plant's root zone, which is effectively a plant's digestive system or stomach. It's an external stomach. So the soil and its bacterial and fungal communities can be seen as analogous to an external stomach of a plant, since these organisms, including a network of mycorrhizal fungi, play a central role in breaking down organic matter into absorbable nutrients, which are available to plants through their large surface area and root systems. So building on this parallel, the body breaks down the foods we eat in an internal and mainly, but not exclusively, anaerobic process that involves symbiotic communities of bacteria, which occupy the stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. And nutrients are absorbed through the huge surface area of the villi lining the gut, a process that is mirrored in the soil, although with plants, the absorption is outside rather than inside. So in general, we can really look at how this is happening. So this bottom picture here is the microvilli in the gut. It's all those little hair-like projections that are coming, that line our GI tract system, that if we were to lay it out in one big flat space, it would be almost the size of this room. It's generally the size of a tennis court. So that's how much space we have to absorb nutrients in our GI tract. It's massive, right? And so ultimately, this picture above is a picture of a carnivorous plant. And you can see how it looks very similar to the microvilli in the gut, right? It's got all these little hair-like protrusions that are creating enzymes that if an insect comes and lands on it, it's going to digest that enzyme and take those nutrients into it when it lands on it. But when we're looking in the soil, that's happening below ground with the microbes, right? So it's really interesting. So, but this picture kind of leads me to the next concept that I want to discuss, which is called the doctrine of signatures. And this is something that I was introduced to in herb school in the late 90s. And it was a concept of observation that really had a profound impact on me in understanding holism. And so Paracelsus was a physician and an alchemist in the 1400s who promoted this philosophy of doctrine of signatures. And basically, it is the concept that the external portion of a plant will tell you what it can be helpful with. So that the knowledge of the inner essence is based on outer characteristics, right? And, sometimes we can see this in humans. Sometimes we see somebody who's kind of red-faced and inflamed, and that can also show that their disposition can be a little bit intense and inflammatory, right? So this happens in everything. It happens in a tree, it happens in a plant, it happens in an animal, right? So looking for signs is a very important thing, and all of us know this in regenerative ag, that observation is such a huge important thing to consider. But this doctrine of signatures was really interesting because it basically showed that the doctrine of signature as proof that the microcosm and the macrocosm were analogous and as above, so below, right? So we can see the patterns in everything. And I think that this is a very important thing to consider. So this is an example of the doctrine of signatures. And in the Cherokee culture in North Carolina, I picked up this book recently, and it was talking about how the Cherokees always used ferns for rheumatoid arthritis because they looked at the plant and they saw that the plant was curled up and that it would then unfurl. And so they would use it for rheumatoid arthritis because in this condition where hands are curled up, the plant would help unroll that and take care of the inflammation that was happening in the rheumatic condition. So this is a very interesting concept. And ultimately, it's just one way that we can make observations, right? But in general, we have to look at observations all across the board. So we need to observe the land, we need to observe our bodies, we need to observe our animals. Very few of us are taught how to really understand how something is making us feel, even though every single thing that we take into our body is a message that's telling our body to do something or not to do something, right? When we drink coffee, it's telling our adrenal glands to secrete cortisol and we wake up, right? But every little thing is doing the same thing. When we eat wheat, it secretes a neurotransmitter in the body that has an opioid-like effect and actually causes a calming, relaxing feeling in our body, right? But we don't even know that, but we crave pizza and we crave pasta, right? So ultimately, we have to think about these different things. And when we teach ourselves to think about what's going on in our body and listen to the messages of our body, we can become better at taking care of ourselves. So also we need to observe our animals, right? Is the cow's nose coated in mucus? Are their hoofs cracked? Are they bellowing for unknown reasons? What is their appetite like? Do they have a strong appetite? Do they have a low appetite? And what does their manure tell us? These are all things that we look at in our animals, but we can do the same thing with our body and the same thing with our land. If we go to smell our soil and it smells putrid, more than likely we have an anaerobic condition going on. And if we have an anaerobic condition going on, roots are going to be dying, right? Because methane gases are being produced in the soil that's going to be killing the roots and not allowing it to grow, which means no biomass in the soil to create organic matter and no way to take up nutrients, right? And make more biomass above ground. So ultimately, we really need to become good observers of the land. And over time, as I developed my skills of observation, I was also learning the 6 soil health principles. And many of you all, I'm sure, know the 6 soil health principles. But as I taught these soil health principles, I realized that there were different things that you could follow in your nutrition that were analogous to the 6 soil health principles that you could do in nutrition to heal your gut microbiome. So in general, we follow the 6 soil health principles to increase soil microbiology in the soil microbiology. And you can also correlate these 6 principles that I'm going to show you now to help heal your GI tract at the same time. So the first one is to know your context, right? And when we are thinking about this with land management, we might need to think about what's happening here? Are we in a brittle environment or are we in a non-brittle environment? Is it dry? Is it wet? Is it is it a hobby that we're doing, or is it an actual business? We need to know all these things that are going to help us make decisions and ultimately have better management. So we wouldn't manage the right side of this fence in the same way that we would manage the left side of the fence because the context is very different, right? But the same thing is happening in the human, right? So we have something called a food dome. And what that is basically our individual nutritional barcode, right? All the different things that we eat that are influenced by the food supply that we have, our personal choices, our cultural choices, the geography and different things of that socioeconomic status, right? So these are the contexts that we have to think about in terms of our nutrition. Thank you. So this is the main thing. The first one, know your context, and you have to apply it to every other rule that's in there, right? So the next one is armor the gut or keep the soil covered. Thank you very much. So ultimately, when we armor the gut, we're talking about the mucus lining that sits on top of all those microvilli that I showed you in that one picture. And when we keep the soil covered, we're keeping it covered with different plants, hopefully diverse species of plants. And so those plants are kind of resembling the villi and the microvilli of the gut. They're protecting the soil. The plants they're increasing the surface area of absorption, right? They're acting as solar panels, and they're taking in that CO2 from the atmosphere and turning it to sugars that can then go down and feed the plant below, feed the microbes below. They're also hosting an above ground microbiome that protects the plant and the soil too. So we have to remember that all plants have a major microbiome living on top of them as well, that are making all the magic happen and making all these different nutrient transportation go in and out of the stomata of the cell and things of that, stomata of the leaf of the plant. So ultimately, these plants are also producing a lot of phytochemicals, and those phytochemicals are going to be helping the plant protect itself, right? So when an insect, plants and trees and everything are signaling to each other from far away. So when insects are happening maybe in a field over in the next pasture, those plants are sending out a chemical signal. And that chemical signal is traveling and being heard by all the other plants, being sensed by all the other plants. And then they're going to start secreting phytonutrients that are going to help them protect themselves from that insect coming into that pasture. And so ultimately, that's a really important thing to consider, right? So, but when we think about the mucus lining, so in this top picture here, you can see the epithelial tissue cells that line our GI tract. And then that pink stuff is the mucus lining, right? And it's made up of a bunch of different polysaccharides. And in those polysaccharides, in that mucus coating is where the whole microbiome of our gut lives. And those microbes in our gut are secreting enzymes that help us digest the different plants that we're eating. And so ultimately, we're kind of looking at this, right? We've got those epithelial tissues, we have the mucus on top, we have the different microbes in that mucus, and many of us have degraded mucus linings in our GI tracts. And so just like the soil, when that mucus lining is degraded, we're going to have erosion. We're going to have erosion. And what we're going to do is, instead of having these tight little gut cells that are really close together like that, those gut cells become separate And in that separation, undigested food particles enter into our GI tract, and that then becomes what we become food sensitive to. So we either get food sensitivities or maybe a food allergy. Most of us have food sensitivities, not real food allergies. And so when we're looking at all these different things that people can't eat anymore, it doesn't really have to do with, the food itself. It has to do with what's happening in our gut. So we want to keep the soil covered to prevent erosion and to take in more nutrients. And we want to keep our gut mucus lining healthy as well. And so one of the ways that we can do that is consuming green tea. The catechins in green tea help cross-link the mucus proteins in our GI tract, and they make that mucus lining thicker. So does clove oil. So does eating foods like okra and chia and flax, or nopales, which we eat in Texas, which are cactus, and aloe, different things like that, right? So that's how we can protect the mucus lining of our gut. So moving on to the next one, we want to increase biodiversity. And the way we want to do this on the land is both above and below ground. So here we have a microscopic picture from some soil, and those long links or branches there are the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. And then all those other little things are kind of the bacteria and protozoa and different things that are circulating around in the soil that are going to help make that digestive action possible in the soil and bring nutrients up into the plant, right? So what we also need, though, is above ground species, lots of different species, whether it's plants and animals and insects and birds and different things of that sort is really important. And this is a picture called The Secret Life of Plants, I believe. And ultimately it shows, those deep, deep penetrating roots that can happen, and they go at all different levels and bring that diversity of microbiome into the soil as well when we have a lot of that of diversity above ground. In the GI tract, we need to eat a really, really diverse diet. And that was relating back to what Fred had said in his talk about the kids that didn't eat the same thing twice. They were always choosing different foods. Innately, that's something that we've always had to do as hunter and gatherers, right? We've always had to eat various things as we've come upon them. And so by way of eating a diverse diet, we're going to get really diverse microbiomes from those different plants. If any of y'all have ever had like a wild plum, that little frosty coating on the outside of a wild plum, that's a fungus, right? And it's a yeast that goes into our gut and acts as a healthy yeast. But all plants have that, just maybe not as visually. And so ultimately, when we eat a lot of diverse foods, especially foods that are grown in, a farm that aren't sterilized with fertilizers and herbicides, you get a lot more of these different nutrients. And that way, we can increase the gut microbiome, right? So by eating a diverse array of diet and nutrients, we can increase those, the microbiome in our gut. And ultimately, the rule of thumb here is to eat at least 30 different foods per week. So if you can eat 30 different, whether it's meat, vegetables, grains, all of the above, try to get at least 30 different types of foods in your diet if possible. Another thing that's really I want to make note of here is that we've lost a particular species called L. reuteri in the GI tract. And this is a particular species that helps increase oxytocin production in our body. And oxytocin basically allows us to have empathy and compassion for other people, right? And it allows us to feel like we want to be around people and that we want to have social interaction and things of like that sort, right? And we've lost this, right? And how many people here in the past 5 years really don't want to be around people as much as they used to be? It explains a lot, right? So anyway, just this one little species, right, has such massive effects that, when in studies, when it's reintroduced into mice and other animals that they're testing it on, they literally completely change their demeanor and start wanting to be around each other and start sharing and having more compassion and, all these different things is really, really interesting. So just that one little thing, if we can increase a number of different species, we can not only have oxytocin, but we can have more serotonin and all these neurotransmitters that allow us to think more efficiently and behave differently. So the last, well, not the last one, but close to the last one is basically feeding probiotics and keeping living plant root in the ground, right? When we keep living plant root in the ground, we're keeping those nutrients going to feed the soil microbiome, and we are going to proliferate lots of life in the soil. And we need to do the same thing to our GI microbiome. We need to feed it. And so the way that we can do that is through eating prebiotic foods. And so that's going to be things like onions and garlic and apples, even raw potatoes. Raw potato salad is something that, this is promoted in Supergut. And ultimately, by increasing these things, we really increase the microbiome in our GI tract. So keep living plant roots in the ground and eat lots of prebiotics. So prebiotics are non-digestible fiber compounds that pass undigested through the upper part of the gastrointestinal tract, and they're going to stimulate the growth and activity of advantageous bacteria in the colon by acting as a substrate for them. So we also want to minimize disturbance, and we want to minimize disturbance on the ground, right, on the land, by through biological, physical, and chemical disturbances. We want to prevent overgrazing and overtrampling, and we also want to reduce or eliminate tillage and compaction, and we want to reduce or eliminate pesticide and fertilizer use. This is, I think, pretty common sense to most of the people in this room at this point, but maybe not so much minimizing disturbance in the gut. So we want to minimize biological disturbance in the gut. And this is a pretty profound thing, because SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIFO, which is small intestinal fungal overgrowth, basically is running rampant. And according to Dr. William Davis, he says that 1 in 3 people have SIBO. That's more than diabetes in this society. So ultimately, if 1 in 3 people have SIBO, that means that microbes that are associated with fecal matter from the large intestine are cruising up into higher levels of the GI tract, the small intestine, and even the stomach. And they're causing basically fecalization syndrome, which is degrading the GI microbiome and also, turning it into negative microbiome. And so ultimately, we need to really work to make this better. And the way that we do that is by, eating organic foods, trying to consume less glyphosate, eating more whole foods, less refined foods, increasing fermented foods in our diet and different things like that. But ultimately, SIBO is contributing to a huge amount of diseases, from IBS to fibromyalgia, insomnia, restless leg syndrome, skin rashes, gallstones, food allergies, premenstrual issues, and lots of other things like that. So really, if we can get SIBO under control, we can really reduce a lot of the diseases that we're all struggling with. Last but not least, then we have the physical, which is, eating refined foods that cause inflammation. And then chemical is taking antibiotics regularly. There's a lot of natural antibiotics out there, and they work. They might not work as fast, but they don't degrade your microbiome and make you get sick more and more throughout time. So ultimately, if you can figure out some herbal remedies and foods that are going to help increase your immunity and decrease, the bacteria, or decrease your any infection that you have, you are in the long run setting yourself up to be healthier. So last but not least, we want to integrate livestock, and we want to do this literally and figuratively. So by incorporating livestock into our pastures, we're recycling nutrients more and more. We're also putting down dung and urine, which is gone through the ruminant gut and has a lot of microbes in it that can increase the microbiome of the soil, and also putting down that carbon so it can feed the microbiome as well. In humans, we want to integrate livestock by way of our foods, and that's going to happen by way of fermented foods, right? So when we eat fermented foods like kimchi or yogurt or cottage cheese or various things, kombucha, kefir, any of these things, they're going to provide the livestock in our foods that we need to build our gut microbiome as well. So ultimately, we want to increase fermented foods, and we want to integrate livestock into our diets. So this book right here is just a really one of the most impactful books of me for 2021. And Larry and Randy can probably attest to this as well. This is something that we learned in the CREATE program. And basically it's how to do a visual soil assessment, go out and dig a hole, right? We can take soil samples, we can send them off, we can do all kinds of things. But in my opinion, after doing many Haney tests, many microbiology tests, all kinds of things on all different kinds of land, this has been the most useful tool for me. And it really easily spells out. You don't have to have a lot of knowledge or information on soil, being a soil scientist. It really spells out what you look for. And it takes you through a scorecard that you can do to see where your soils are. And then you can do it again the next year. You do it under the fence, you do it out in the middle of the pasture, you see the difference between under the fence where it's not being disturbed and in the pasture where it is being disturbed. And you can start to see, okay, what kind of porosity do I have? What kind of soil structure do I have? What kind of modeling do I have, right? Do I have gray dots in my soil instead of red dots? Because that's showing that you have a lot of anaerobic activity happening in the soil to the metals that are in those soils. You can also look at nodulation in plants and how deep does roots go and how much biomass are those roots as well. And so ultimately, this is a really amazing book. You can find it online. There's also a website that has it without buying the book online as well. But I highly recommend this to kind of just learn about soil health. Secondly, this is Super Gut. This is the book that I was talking about. And I'm sorry, I don't know, this is losing its format. But this is a book that I think is something that everybody should have to read upon being a human and learning how to take care of their GI tracts. It's a really amazing book, just giving the power back to us to help, prevent and heal diseases that we have and that we're struggling with. And then this book here, Toxic Legacy, is written by an MIT scientist, really kind of going through the ins and outs of glyphosate and all the different aspects of what it's doing in our environment and in the human body. And I highly recommend reading this as well. It's not an easy read. It's quite hard to read, but it's very interesting and chock full of information there. So ultimately, I hope what I've given here today kind of provides some a concept for you to think about, right? That the 6 soil health principles can be also applied in your body with just a few easy to do things. It's not hard to do those things that I was just talking about. Getting rid of SIBO, if it's something that you have, can be a much more difficult thing to get rid of, but ultimately it can be done. And that Super Gut book can walk you through it. And I really appreciate y'all having me here. And I hope that y'all are inspired to kind of walk out and be the change and help your communities really find ways of healing, because we're the agriculturalists are the people who have to start that movement. And they're the people who have literally all the power in their hands to do that. And so I appreciate you all for doing all the work you do. And I hope that today you took away some information that will be of use to you. So thanks a lot.
Thanks so much, Kara. Can you do a few questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so if anyone wants to ask questions, and I'm going to start with one. Hang on to that one. Yeah, it was a great presentation. I was wondering about, because being a dairy farmer and all, the lactose intolerance, and then that losing that enzyme. Some people, they get a flu or something, also it's gone. So you can rebuild it with lactate, or sometimes they say eating cheeses magically rebuild it, so that you can cure these diseases then that make you intolerant to certain things.
Well, it really depends on what you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a complete lack of an enzyme to digest dairy, which is, what lactose is. Lactose is the sugar in milk. And if you don't have lactase, which is the enzyme in the body to digest that, then this might not help. That said, though, if it is an intolerance because your gut has been degraded and it's something that you created an intolerance to, then yes, these are the types of things that you can do to rebuild your GI tract and begin to digest those foods more efficiently. Yeah.
And then one more before I guess you could make your way to the mic if you don't. Oh, you got the mic. Sorry. Okay. You're showing the purple tomatoes.
Yes.
So are you in favor of genetically modified
Well, I'm not in favor of gene splicing, but most plants are obviously genetically manipulated. But yeah, gene splicing, mostly it's not necessarily gene splicing. I think more for me, it's just that a lot of genetically modified foods are being made to have greater tolerance to glyphosate. And so more glyphosate is being used. And that's the part of genetically modified foods that I'm not that into, as well as some other things. I mean, that's a big topic of conversation, but really, if we're breeding foods so that we have to use more chemicals on them and spend more money rather than actually breeding a food that is supposedly going to save the world because it's genetically modified, then it shouldn't need some additional input on it to make the world have more food.
Right. No, I was just thinking about potatoes that would, be immune to certain rots, and then apples that would resist bruising and things like that. So
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a broad field, right? So it's really comes down to how is that food going to be used or grown and that type of thing. Yeah.
thank you. Go ahead.
You mentioned at the start that increased atmospheric CO2 is decreasing protein in food. So like, how is that happening? What's the mechanism that's
That's a good question. I don't know, but I can show you the research paper and I bet it will say it in there as something I could look into. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's like it increases, it's decreasing protein content. It increases woody encroachment and decreases grass growth. So, there's all these little nuances, but yeah, I don't know why. That's a really good question and I'll look into it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I got another quick one while we were changing the mic. Oxytocin, like you're saying, it makes you want to meet with people more.
Well, oxytocin is the chemical that is released in a mother when she's breastfeeding and when a baby's breastfeeding as well. So yeah, it's that bonding brain chemical that allows us to feel connected and in love, actually. So yes, by increasing that one bacteria species, Lactobacillus reuteri, we can increase oxytocin in our bodies and increase that feeling of love.
So alcohol does that too.
While degrading your GI tract, unfortunately.
Next question, please.
I don't know if, okay. I just have a strictly opinion question from you. You were talking about how animals are using 70% of the antibiotics. In my mind, I look at the human to animal ratio and like the animal population is huge compared to humans. So to me, that almost seems too low. I just wondered what your opinion was on like who's contributing more to some of these issues. Is it the livestock people who are, trying to treat their cattle and prevent things in their cattle versus nowadays there's more humans that run to the doctor as soon as they have a runny nose or, oh, little Timmy's got a cough. And, there seems to be a lot less farm kid mentality now where, rub a little dirt on it and you'll be fine.
Yeah.
I just wonder what's your opinion on the human aspect of it versus the livestock. Where do you think is contributing more to the gut issues that are coming from antibiotic things?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think with regard to the antibiotic use in animals, that's more for promoting growth, right? Because antibiotics are given to promote growth in animals and increase, gain. So I don't think that, I mean, depending on the type of operation, right? If you're in a feedlot, you might just put antibiotics in the water in general. But for, most producers who are dealing with cattle on the land, usually that antibiotic use is pretty minimal, right? And just for doctoring. But from the bigger standpoint of these big food systems, big animal feeding places, I'd imagine it's pretty significant and probably more significant than what humans are contributing. But I definitely agree with you. I mean, how many people here have given antibiotics to their kids more than twice between age 1 and 8 for an ear infection? quite a few hands, right? So it's like right there, just for 2 ear infections in the first 8 years of your life, taking antibiotics, you've just really degraded your microbiome. And if you're not, if your kid's eating Fruit Loops and, hot dogs and mac and cheese, chicken nuggets and pizza, which is, the 5 food groups for kids.
You forgot candy.
And candy, right? Yeah. Then ultimately, they're not going to be able to rebuild a good microbiome because all those foods are sugar rich, and those sugar rich foods contribute to the overgrowth of the bad bacteria in the GI tract. So, it's pretty significant. It's, I at all costs really try to avoid antibiotics. And luckily I grew up in a family that, we didn't run to the doctor for everything, but I still had them for ear infections on occasion, so I know it's really hard to avoid, but there are ways to do preventative illness, prevent yourself from illness, and to avoid taking them and use natural methods.
Can we even fix this problem of food issues and things just because of the fact that our mental state in this world is so different than it used to be? I guess what I mean by that is I'm a firm believer in the idea that our world is degrading very quickly, and our mental state is degrading very quickly, right? We live in a very me-focused society, right? So everything we do is for personal gain, personal health, self-preservation, if you will, right? So I don't know, and I know, I don't want to steer this into a big political, but I guess all I'm curious about is how do we fight that is there foods, is there practices, things we can do to change our very mental state? Because I believe that's a humongous part of the problem, more than and I guess I'm speaking from I'm a commercial farmer. I'm part of the problem, I guess. I put on a lot of glyphosate, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also I only put on as much as I need because it's gone up. It's gone up, 40 to 50% what it was last year. So
Mm-hmm.
it's expensive. I'm not just going to dump it on because I want to, right? But I guess my point to the question, just to end this question off, is just is there a way that we can fix our, in my opinion, our very broken brains? What do we do to change our mentality? Because if we can't change our me-centered, me-focused mentality, how do we fix the rest of the problems again? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes absolute sense. And I love the question. I think it's a very, very important question. And I think the answer is make yogurt. Because yes, I really, really do think that a big reason why we are so collapsed mentally is that our microbiomes are not in there doing their job. As Fred was showing, that, it's what we eat that helps us choose what we're going to eat next, right? And so when we're building this microbiome, it actually has profound influences on giving guidance in what it wants us to eat. I mean, the whole reason why we're all eating a bunch of wheat and dairy is because that has a lot of sugar in it that the bad GI microbes want. And so, I mean, haven't you ever gone to bed? I mean, even last night, I was sitting here watching Randy, and I was like, I just want something sweet, and it was just overwhelming. And I just wanted to get something sweet. And so that is literally cues coming from what's happening in my GI tract. And so I do think that by way of not only making yogurt, so in that Super Gut book, he walks you through, a very extensive pathway to healing your microbiome. But one of those things is to make your own yogurt, because store-bought yogurt doesn't have the microbes in it. And even if you're dairy intolerant, you can do it with coconut milk. And so ultimately you buy probiotic capsules, because when we take probiotic capsules, they don't have the same potencies that we can get from yogurt in terms of the live cultures, right? So when you buy a yogurt maker and you pour some of those little capsules of the different prebiotics into your yogurt, you can make your own healing medicinal yogurt. And ultimately you cook it for about 3 days instead of 24 hours. And that brings up all the different bacteria in higher quantities. And then you can repopulate, you can re-inoculate your gut with that. Now, that said, you also have to do other things like, try to eat organic, try to minimize your alcohol intake. That one's the hardest. Doing different things that are going to decrease sugar in the body, and then make these yogurts and then eat the prebiotic foods. So you have to move towards a more whole food diet. And, but it doesn't have to be complicated. You can eat simply and eat with whole foods. And, the herbs and spices are everything. The phytonutrients in those herbs and spices that we use, the more fresh herbs you can use, which I'm sure is harder here, but, eating spices, adding clove, right? Making clove tea. That clove tea increases the mucus lining in your gut. You just put a couple cloves in a glass of water and you drink it. You buy some matcha, drink some matcha tea. It can help you reduce your coffee. I've started drinking 1 cup of matcha and 1 cup of coffee. And so there's just all these little things. And I mean, I really can't speak highly enough of that book, Super Gut, because it lays it all out.
I'll ask one more question. What about Metamucil?
Well, I think that we can get a lot of fibers from our diet, right? And so a lot of people who use Metamucil are not eating enough fiber, right? So if you really hone in on eating those 30 different types of foods per day, more likely you're going to be getting more vegetables in your diet. So I would definitely just try to increase that. Now, there's other fibers that you can take, psyllium husk is a great fiber, and it also contributes to the mucus lining in the GI tract because it has that mucilaginous. If you've ever, stirred up a cup of psyllium husk, it gets very thick, right? But you can take it in capsules too. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay. I just wanted, I guess, to kind of like ask you specifically. I know you're in Texas, so I don't know the cultural implications about food there, but I just know here there's certain groups, specifically marginalized groups, that have a way worse microbiome just due to the history of food deserts. And for example, I know in my area, certain reserves were given really crappy farmland, and a lot of their traditional practices were not taken away, but I guess sort of forcibly terminated. So I'm just wondering, in the sense of of course, switching over to better agricultural practices and eating better food, but how, as for people who already have such degraded microbiomes just by generations already, this is already 100 years into, or not 100 years, but I just know my family, for example, they've stopped farming for 2 generations now and stopped growing their own food and whatnot. And so I guess, what is your advice to kind of I guess what you were this other gentleman was saying about the whole
the mental capacity.
And just, is it almost will this take generations to heal?
It doesn't have to take generations to heal. I mean, we can really heal our GI tracts in, in 6 months. We could get them back into a decent place. Now, I particularly recognize that here, you just don't have access to everything here in your grocery stores, I imagine, in terms of a freshness of vegetables and things of that in comparison to Texas. In Texas, we have a huge Latino community that is incredibly attached to corn as part of their cultural spirituality in some cases, and just from a cultural likeness, right? And so corn is one of those foods that can really degrade the GI tract a lot because of its sugars and chemical pesticides and different things like that. So yes, these things are everywhere. They are healable, And, you know, I think that this is, well, let's see. Ian and I, is that right? Ian and I were talking about this earlier. We were talking about public health and, you know, how public health often talks about the complete, well, oftentimes almost tell you the complete opposite thing, right? You were talking about this farm mentality of growing up and being exposed to, you know, manure on a farm, and that actually increases the capacity for somebody to have a healthier microbiome because they're exposed to more things. So let's see, where am I headed with this? Ultimately, I think that yes, everybody can heal their gut. Everybody can heal their gut. And yes, it can be harder for people who do not have the same socioeconomic status as somebody or the same access to foods as others. But I do believe it can be done. I mean, I think just buying a yogurt maker alone, right, which is $35 at the most, like you can buy on Amazon, this one cheap yogurt maker.
You don't even need like
don't
a
even need
yogurt
a
maker.
yogurt maker.
You
No,
just
you
need
don't.
like a
Yeah.
pot
Yeah,
and an oven
exactly.
and a jar
Right. And some milk.
and some milk.
Or some coconut milk and some inulin for the coconut milk. But ultimately, yes, I mean, I think that alone, right? Just that alone is something most people have access to that they could begin to do. They could begin to start there, right? So am I answering your question?
Yeah. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a hard question, right? It leads into bigger things, but I think that one of the reasons why we continue to stay in suppressed mentalities, no matter what your culture, is because of our nutritional status, that we are all so depleted and we just do not have the capacity for a lot of things because of it.
Okay, thank you so much, Kara.